February 1945. The maps in the Führer bunker showed Soviet forces closing on the Hungarian oil fields near Lake Balaton, and Adolf Hitler studied the fuel production reports with the intensity of a man reading his own death sentence. Germany's last significant source of natural oil lay 90 miles from Soviet tanks, and every staff officer in the room understood what the numbers meant. The Reich was running dry. Hitler's hand trembled slightly as he set down the report. 55,000 tons of crude oil per month from Hungary. It was barely enough to matter, barely enough to keep a fraction of the Luftwaffe flying or the Panzer divisions moving, but it was all Germany had left. The Plost fields in Romania, which had once supplied nearly 2 million tons per year, had vanished when Romania switched sides the previous August. The synthetic fuel plants, bombed relentlessly by American and British aircraft, produced almost nothing anymore. Hungary's modest wells represented the last drops of oil flowing into German tanks. "The 6th SS Panzer Army will attack here," Hitler said, his finger stabbing at the map near Lake Balaton. His voice carried the same absolute certainty it always had, as if conviction alone could bend reality. "We will throw the Soviets back across the Danube. We will secure the oil fields." The generals exchanged glances. Heinz Guderian, chief of the General Staff, had argued for hours that the offensive was madness, that Germany needed every available division to defend Berlin, that the war was already lost. Hitler had dismissed him with a wave. The Hungarian oil fields would be held. They had to be held. Without oil, nothing else mattered. What Hitler did not say, what perhaps he could not let himself acknowledge, was that the Reich had been dying of thirst for months already. The fuel crisis had become so acute that new tanks sat motionless in German factories, waiting for gasoline that would never come. Pilots received their wings and then sat grounded for lack of aviation fuel. The Kriegsmarine's remaining submarines stayed in port. The entire German war machine, once the most mobile and mechanized force in history, had begun to calcify into immobility. The numbers told the story Hitler refused to hear. In March of 1944, Germany's synthetic fuel plants had produced 316,000 tons of fuel. By September, after months of Allied bombing, production had collapsed to 17,000 tons. By February of 1945, the figure had dropped to nearly zero. The plants at Löhne, Pörlitz, Brucks, and Blechhammer lay in ruins or operated at a fraction of capacity. Their distillation towers shattered, their coal gasification units destroyed. This was why Hungary mattered so desperately. This was why Hitler had poured Germany's last reserves into Operation Spring Awakening, the offensive designed to push Soviet forces away from Lake Balaton and secure the oil fields. 600 tanks, the cream of what remained of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, had been assembled for an attack that every rational military mind knew was futile. But Hitler was no longer operating on rational military calculations. He was operating on the arithmetic of survival. Without oil, Germany would cease to exist as a fighting force within weeks. The offensive began on March 6, 1945. The 6th SS Panzer Army, including the elite 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, crashed into Soviet defensive lines south of Lake Balaton. For 3 days, German tanks advanced through mud and snow, pushing Soviet forces back, reclaiming miles of Hungarian territory. Hitler received the reports in the bunker with something approaching joy. The maps showed arrows pointing east. The offensive was working. Then the spring thaw arrived in full force. The Hungarian plain, already soft from winter snow, transformed into an ocean of mud. Tanks that weighed 45 tons sank to their hulls. Half-tracks churned uselessly, their engines screaming, going nowhere. Fuel trucks, struggling to reach the front through the morass, consumed more gasoline than they delivered, and the Soviets, who had been retreating, stopped retreating. On March 15th, Soviet forces counterattacked. They struck not at the exhausted German spearheads, but at the flanks, at the supply lines, at the vulnerable points where German units had stretched themselves thin, trying to maintain momentum. Within 48 hours, the German offensive had stalled completely. Within a week, it had become a retreat. Hitler's response, when the reports reached him, was volcanic. He raged at his generals, accusing them of cowardice and incompetence. He blamed the SS divisions for failing to break through, despite the fact that those same divisions had been fighting with a ferocity born of desperation. He ordered courts-martial for officers who had failed to show sufficient offensive spirit. He demanded to know why the tanks had stopped, as if the laws of physics and logistics could be overruled by willpower. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, watched Hitler's fury with a mixture of pity and horror. Speer had been trying for months to make Hitler understand the fuel situation, to make him see that Germany's military capabilities were now measured not in divisions or tanks, but in barrels of oil. In a meeting shortly after the failure of Spring Awakening, Speer presented Hitler with production figures that showed Germany had perhaps 6 weeks of fuel remaining, and that was assuming no major operations. Hitler's reaction was to dismiss the figures as defeatist. "We will produce more," he said. "The synthetic plants will be repaired. Production will increase." Speer tried to explain that the plants could not be repaired, that the specialized equipment needed to rebuild them no longer existed, that the skilled workers had been killed or conscripted, that the Allied bombing had been too thorough. Hitler refused to listen. He turned to other advisors, ones who told him what he wanted to hear, ones who assured him that fuel production would somehow recover. But reality could not be argued with. By late March, Soviet forces had broken through the German lines in Hungary and were advancing rapidly toward the Austrian border. The Hungarian oil fields, the ones Hitler had sacrificed his last mobile reserves to protect, fell to Soviet troops on March 30th. The Germans had held them for exactly 24 days after the failure of Spring Awakening. When the news reached the Führer bunker, Hitler received it in silence. No rage this time, no accusations of betrayal or cowardice. Just silence. He studied the map for several minutes, his eyes moving across the red arrows showing Soviet advances, the shrinking territory still marked in blue for German control. Then he turned away from the map and walked to his private quarters, without a word. Those who were present later described it as the moment Hitler seemed to age a decade in an instant. The fury that had sustained him, the absolute conviction that willpower could overcome material reality, appeared to drain away. What replaced it was something worse, a kind of detached fatalism, a sense that he was now simply going through the motions of a script whose ending had already been written. But the script was not quite finished. Germany still held the oil fields at Zistersdorf in Austria, tiny wells that produced perhaps 5,000 tons per month, barely enough to fuel a single Panzer division for a week. Hitler ordered these fields defended with the same absolute language he had used for Hungary. They would be held at all costs. They would not fall. The costs turned out to be irrelevant because Germany had nothing left to pay them with. The divisions that might have defended Zistersdorf were trapped in Budapest or destroyed in Hungary or desperately trying to hold back Soviet forces advancing on Vienna. When Soviet troops reached the Austrian oil fields in early April, they found them defended by a mixture of old men from the Volkssturm, teenage boys from the Hitler Youth, and a handful of exhausted Wehrmacht soldiers who had somehow survived the retreat from Hungary. The battle for Zistersdorf lasted less than a day. The defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they were already dead. Some of the Hitler Youth boys, children of 14 and 15 years old, operated Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons they had barely been trained to use. They died in their positions, still clutching weapons that weighed almost as much as they did. By April 8th, the last oil field under German control had fallen. The Reich now possessed no natural sources of petroleum. The synthetic plants produced nothing. The reserves, The strategic stockpiles that had been built up over years of careful planning were exhausted. Germany's war machine had finally, completely, run out of fuel. Hitler's response to this final loss was not recorded in any dramatic outburst or memorable statement. Instead, there was simply an absence. He stopped asking about fuel production reports. He stopped planning offensives that required mobile operations. His orders became increasingly divorced from reality, calling for counterattacks by divisions that no longer existed, for air support from planes that could not fly, for tank movements that were physically impossible. In one of his last military conferences in mid-April, Hitler outlined a plan for a massive counter-offensive that would drive the Soviets back from Berlin. The generals listened in stunned silence as he described the movements of armies that had been destroyed weeks earlier, the deployment of tanks that sat immobile for lack of fuel, the air support from a Luftwaffe that could barely put a dozen planes in the air. When he finished, no one spoke. What was there to say? Guderian, who would be dismissed shortly after for his continued defeatism, later wrote that Hitler had become a man living in a fantasy world of his own creation, where armies moved on maps regardless of whether they had fuel, where production figures meant whatever he needed them to mean, where defeat was always just a temporary setback that could be overcome by will and determination. But in quieter moments, there were hints that Hitler understood exactly what the loss of oil meant. Speer recorded a conversation from late April in which Hitler spoke about Germany's future, or rather its lack of one. A people that cannot secure its own fuel supply, Hitler said, has no right to exist. We have failed. The German people have failed. They will have to live with the consequences. It was a remarkable statement from a man who had spent 12 years insisting that Germany's destiny was to dominate Europe, that the German people was superior to all others, that the Reich would last 1,000 years. The loss of oil had not just defeated Germany militarily. It had shattered the fundamental mythology on which the entire Nazi project had been built. The reality was that Germany's oil crisis had been foreseeable from the beginning. The Reich had never possessed adequate natural oil resources. The decision to invade the Soviet Union had been driven in part by the desire to seize the Caucasus oil fields, an objective that had failed spectacularly at Stalingrad. The synthetic fuel program, for all its technical sophistication, had never been able to produce enough to meet Germany's needs. And the strategic bombing campaign had exposed the fundamental vulnerability of a war machine dependent on a handful of easily targeted industrial plants. Hitler had gambled that Germany could win the war before oil became a decisive factor. He had gambled that the synthetic plants could produce enough to sustain operations. He had gambled that the Ploughed fields would remain secure, that Hungary could be held, that somehow the arithmetic of fuel consumption versus fuel production would work out in Germany's favor. Every gamble had failed. By the time the last oil fields fell, the outcome of the war had long since been decided. Berlin was surrounded. The Western Allies were across the Rhine. The Soviets were preparing their final assault on the capital. But the loss of oil was still significant because it marked the moment when Hitler's fantasy of a last-minute reversal, of a miraculous counter-offensive that would turn the tide, became physically impossible. You cannot wage mobile warfare without fuel. You cannot run tanks without gasoline. You cannot fly planes without aviation fuel. These are not matters of will or determination or racial superiority. They are matters of chemistry and physics, and they do not care about ideology. The soldiers who had fought to defend the Hungarian and Austrian oil fields understood this in a way their supreme commander apparently could not. They had watched their tanks run dry in the middle of battles. They had seen trucks abandoned by the roadside because there was no fuel to move them. They had experienced the helplessness of facing enemy armor while their own panzers sat motionless, useless, giant steel coffins waiting for gasoline that would never arrive. One German tank commander, writing after the war, described the final weeks in Hungary. "We had the finest tanks in the world. the best trained crews, superior tactics and doctrine. None of it mattered. We would advance a few kilometers, and then the fuel trucks would fail to arrive. We would sit there, watching Soviet tanks maneuver around us, unable to move, unable to do anything but wait for the inevitable. It was not defeat in battle. It was defeat by arithmetic. This was Hitler's legacy in the final weeks of the war. Armies that could not move, planes that could not fly, a war machine that had ground to a halt, not because it had been beaten in combat, but because it had simply run out of fuel. The maps in the Führer bunker still showed unit designations and defensive lines and planned counterattacks, but they were meaningless. Without oil, they were just lines on paper, symbols of forces that no longer existed in any practical sense. On April 22nd, in one of his last recorded military conferences, Hitler erupted in fury when told that a particular SS Panzer division could not be moved to reinforce the defense of Berlin. Why not? He demanded. The answer was simple. No fuel. The tanks could not move. The trucks could not transport the infantry. The division was combat effective only if the battle came to it, because it could not go to the battle. Hitler's response was to order the division moved anyway. The order was acknowledged and then quietly ignored, because it was impossible. The fuel did not exist. Reality had finally imposed itself in a way that could not be argued with or raged against or overcome by force of will. 8 days later, Hitler was dead by his own hand in the bunker beneath Berlin. The Reich he had promised would last 1,000 years survived him by 1 week. And across the ruins of Germany, thousands of tanks sat motionless, monuments to a war machine that had choked on its own ambition, that had expanded beyond its ability to sustain itself, that had finally, inevitably, run dry. The Hungarian and Austrian oil fields, the last sources of natural petroleum under German control, had fallen to Soviet forces in March and April of 1945. They had produced, at most, 60,000 tons of oil per month combined, a fraction of what Germany needed, a drop in the bucket compared to what the Ploest fields had once provided. Their loss had not changed the outcome of the war. That had been decided long before, on the frozen steppes of Russia, in the skies over Germany, in the Allied factories that produced more tanks and planes and fuel than Germany could ever hope to match. But their loss had marked the end of Hitler's ability to pretend that somehow, through some miracle of will or wonder weapons or last-minute diplomatic reversal, Germany might still prevail. The maps could show whatever they wanted. The plans could be as bold as imagination allowed. None of it mattered without fuel. What Hitler said when Germany's last oil fields fell was, in the end, less important than what he could no longer say. He could no longer promise victory. He could no longer order offensives that required mobility. He could no longer maintain the fiction that Germany's situation was anything other than hopeless. The loss of oil had stripped away the last pretense, the last possibility of self-deception. The Reich had run dry, and with it, so had Hitler's delusions. What remained was just the waiting, the final collapse, the inevitable end that had been written in the fuel production reports months earlier, if only anyone had been willing to read them clearly. In the history of the Second World War, the fall of Germany's last oil fields is often treated as a footnote, a minor detail in the larger story of the Reich's collapse. But for the soldiers who fought without fuel, for the commanders who planned operations that could not be executed, for the civilians who watched their country grind to a halt, it was the moment when the war's outcome became not just probable but certain, not just likely but physically inevitable. Hitler had built his empire on movement, on the lightning war that had conquered Poland and France, on the mobile operations that had driven deep into the Soviet Union. He had ended it in stasis, in immobility, in a bunker beneath a city he could no longer defend because the tanks could not move and the planes could not fly and the fuel was gone. That was what the loss of the oil fields meant. Not a dramatic turning point or a climactic battle, but simply the final confirmation of a reality that had been approaching for months. Germany had lost the war, not because its soldiers lacked courage or its weapons lacked quality, but because it had run out of the one resource that made modern war possible. Hitler's reaction, his rage and denial and eventual silence, was the reaction of a man confronting the limits of will, the point where determination and ideology and racial theory collided with the hard facts of industrial production and resource availability. He had believed that Germany could overcome any material disadvantage through superior spirit and leadership. The empty fuel tanks proved otherwise. The last oil fields fell, and with them fell the last possibility of anything other than complete defeat. What Hitler said mattered less than what he could no longer do. The war of movement was over. The war of survival in place had begun, and it would last exactly 3 more weeks before the Reich collapsed entirely. Its armies immobile, its air force grounded, its war machine finally, completely, irreversibly out of fuel.